Everyone talks about menopause, but menopause is the finish line. Perimenopause is the marathon, and it can take a decade. A decade is not unheard of for perimenopause. And so, I feel like growing up, everyone was talking about menopause, but menopause is the end of this much longer process. And so, if you're not in perimenopause yet, if you're approaching perimenopause, just FYI, it can take a long time to get to the very end and to hit the point where it's no longer something you're thinking about. On this episode of the Harness the Power of Planning podcast, I'm going to talk about my recent lab test that told me I have high cholesterol that I need to start thinking about and what I'm going to do about it on this chit-chat only portion of podcast episode number 75, starting now. Hi, Alegre here, and it is just me today because Natasha is being a mom, and sometimes being a mom means that other things have to fall by the wayside. And this week's topic is coming up with a game plan for the holidays. But before I talk about that, we always do some chit chat, and I definitely had some thoughts about things that I wanted to talk about today. And so even though it's just me and there's not two people doing the chit chat, I want to talk about it, and feel free to chime in wherever you are watching this. If you comment in the comment section, I will see it. Hello, Deepesh. And I am happy to comment and answer any questions that you may have. And also, this is a conversation. I would love to hear your thoughts on this. And so I guess something that I've been thinking about a lot lately is, my health and my, I recently got a checkup and I got my blood drawn, and I have, for the first time in my life, high cholesterol. Anyone else have high cholesterol out there? Let me know. Let me know if you have high cholesterol. And for those of you who watched before, I am 50 years old, so I'm deep into perimenopause, and menopause is right around the corner. In fact, I would say I am in year 9 of perimenopause. Of course, it's hard to know exactly where you are in menopause, but that's my guess. And so if you are someone who is going through or entering perimenopause, you might not know that it is very natural once you hit perimenopause and menopause for your cholesterol to spike. Okay. And I'm going to explain why, because this is something I did not know until I hit this age. So for women, we actually use cholesterol. Our body uses cholesterol to make the hormones that we need. And so your body is no longer using cholesterol. So guess what happens? Your cholesterol spikes. So I went from having very, very low cholesterol to suddenly now I have high cholesterol because I'm in the stage of life where my body is not using up the cholesterol to make the hormones. I don't know if that's news to you. That was news to me. And so I had learned this just like when I was entering, as I said, I think I'm in year 9 of perimenopause. And for those of you who are not in it, you might be wondering, well, how do you know you're in year 9? Because after many, many years of decades, after decades, decades, I can't believe I can say that. After, let's see, 13, right? After 3.5 decades of being very regular with my period, I went from 12 to 11 to 10 to 9. Literally, I just lost one period every year for about 6 years. And then about 3 years ago, I started having other symptoms. So that means waking up in the middle of the night, usually around 2 in the morning, wide awake, could not go back to sleep. The other thing was I had always been the one in our relationship that was cold. I don't know if you're there, but I'm like, I need a blanket, I need a sweater, it's cold. And I suddenly became the person who was hot, who was warm. Like, is it just me or is it warm in here? And so those were the main 2 symptoms that I was having, was feeling warm. I wouldn't call it a hot flash. I never got sweaty, and I was never uncomfortable. I was just, how come you're wearing sweaters and I feel like I need a t-shirt? And then the waking up in the middle of the night. So those were my big 2 symptoms that came on about 3 years ago. And I have been able to completely manage my symptoms with herbs. I started going to an acupuncturist. She gave me some herbs. Also, I did a bunch of reading. I took some herbs. And actually, if I'm going to put up in the QR code, if you are interested in oh, let me see where I can put that. Okay, I have to find it first. But I actually have consolidated all the herbs that I take in a list on Amazon so that you can see it completely there. So let me just put this up. And so anyway, so I've been able to completely manage my symptoms with all these different kinds of herbs. And so the interesting thing about perimenopause, and I don't know if you all feel this, but for me, the interesting thing about perimenopause is that you everyone talks about menopause, and menopause is when you haven't had your period for 12 years. Okay. Everyone talks about menopause, but menopause is the finish line. Perimenopause is the marathon, and it can take a decade. A decade is not unheard of for perimenopause. And so, I feel like growing up, everyone was talking about menopause, but menopause is the end of this much longer process. And so, if you're not in perimenopause yet, if you're approaching perimenopause, just FYI, it can take a long time to get to the very end and to hit the point where it's no longer something you're thinking about. So, all of that is to say that now cholesterol is an issue for me. It's never been a cholesterol for me. And by the way, tinyurl.com, my Amazon picks, all one word, PICKS, my Amazon picks. That's where you can get all the herbs that I use. And by the way, for those of you who are watching live, if you for some reason have to step away, I do upload these live chats as the Harness the Power of Planning podcast. So you can listen wherever you get your podcasts. This will be episode 75 when I put it up. So the Harness the Power of Planning podcast, that is somewhere you can go to listen to this. So I suddenly went from having super low cholesterol to super high cholesterol, not unexpected. However, it's kind of been creeping up. And this year I have officially entered the it is too high area. And I feel like I'm totally having to relearn my body because of this change. And so I've actually been reading a book for the last 6 months. It's called How Not to Die. And the author's name is, let me look it up, Dr. Michael Greger. And it is a lot of information, let me tell you. And by the way, by How Not to Die, he's not trying to say you're going to live forever. Each chapter is like how not to die from cancer, how not to die from high blood pressure, how not to die from medical errors. That was actually one of the chapters. It was very interesting. So, it's all these topics, and he had actually been talking about cholesterol. And so serendipitously, he mentioned that some of the things that help to lower cholesterol are eating beans and legumes. And I was vegetarian for a long time, and I actually didn't really call myself vegetarian. I called myself a flexitarian because I would eat turkey at Thanksgiving, or if I, went to someone's house, I would eat whatever they made. And I was vegetarian for a long time until actually I was vegetarian up until the third trimester of my pregnancy. And I used to eat tons of beans and legumes. And so I have actually been thinking for the last couple of years about going back to eating more plant-based. And this book, How Not to Die, is very much a proponent of plant-based whole food diet. This doctor actually says that he doesn't like the terms vegetarian and vegan because he feels like the focus then is on what you don't eat rather than what you do eat. And fair enough. I feel like, you know, whole foods, plant-based is a fair way to describe how I used to eat and how I've been thinking I need to start eating again. And so I actually started eating more whole foods plant-based about 2 weeks ago. And so we'll see how it goes. I'll be checking in, regularly on this live chat and on the podcast with how I'm feeling. It's funny because it's been, almost 15 years since I was last, vegetarian, last whole foods plant-based. So it's been a while. I feel like I'm having to remember how I ate. And one of the big epiphanies, for those of you out there who maybe are whole foods plant-based, I would love any guidance that you have. I'm sure we could all benefit from it. But one of the epiphanies I remember having when I was switching to being whole foods plant-based, 20 some odd years ago, I remember the epiphany I had was I need to think about my main dish might be something that I used to think about as a side dish, because that was the hardest thing for me to wrap my head around is, well, what's going to be my main dish? We're so used to entrees being meat or animal based that wrapping your head around, okay, well, how do I cook food without that entree is a different way of thinking. And so I remember having this epiphany 20 some odd years ago where I said, a side dish can be a main dish. There's no reason it can't be. It's funny, these little rules and barriers we think of that we come up with that we don't even realize we come up with. Like, I didn't even know I had this sort of cultural barrier about, like, well, an entree must be animal based, but clearly I had it because I was having the hardest time saying, well, what are we going to eat for dinner? Breakfast and lunch weren't such a big deal because breakfast is often a smoothie. Sometimes it's a parfait. Sometimes it's, an apple with peanut butter. So that was not hard. And lunch is has been a kale salad for most of the last 3 decades. So that hasn't been hard. Although I have added a lot of chicken and eggs over the years. So now I'm just going back to just having the salad and adding some beans or legumes because, as Dr. Michael Greger said, these will help with my cholesterol. So I'm very interested to see where my cholesterol is in a year from now because I am making this change and I am going to be adding in more foods that can help with cholesterol now that it's an issue. Perimenopause. And I look forward to checking back with you in a year. I'm actually going to try and see if I can get my blood tested sooner than a year because I like to know if these changes are helping or if I need to be more aggressive. However, my husband his cholesterol has also been inching up. And so we're making this change together, which is a lot easier. The challenge is that my child has never eaten quote unquote whole foods plant-based. And so it's a shift for her eating more. She's grown up with beans and legumes, but perhaps not the quantity that we are now going to be eating. So we'll see how this goes and I will check in with you. And if you have any tips, if you want to respond, even after this is no longer live, we see the questions and we'd be happy to respond. And we'd love to learn from you all. So that's what's going on. That's what I'm thinking about. Cholesterol and how to lower it through diet and exercise too, to some point. But I feel like I get in a lot of good movement. So I feel like for me, diet is definitely going to play the bigger role in this. Join us next week when my friend Christine Keegan will be joining me. You might have heard Christine in earlier versions of my podcast, and I'm excited to be bringing her back. She's a mom, and she is my go-to person when I am trying to figure out the perfect thing to say to someone. She's really, really great at using what's known as nonviolent communication. So join me for that, and we'll see you next week. Dream wild, wild dreamers. Thanks for joining us for the Harness the Power of Planning podcast. Be sure to like and subscribe wherever you listen.